Welcome back to another episode of Acquired Taste, a show about deep diving the nuances and evolution of modern product design and strategy. I am your co-host, David Issa, a digital transformation consultant and product designer focused on helping companies evolve culture and close the gap between strategy and execution of ideas. I'm here with my colleague, Jeremy Belcher.
What's up? I'm a longtime product designer and now the founder of Robot Heart, a custom software and app studio, working with startups and operating companies to build new products and to build on top of existing platforms that they already have. So today we're going to talk about something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, just because I feel like these are tools we use all the time, and that is kind of software development tools. I don't even know what these are called, but it's Jira and it's Linear, and we're gonna talk about the battle between those. How would you even classify those? What do you call those? What's the category those are in?
I mean, technically, they've always been project management tools or product management tools.
But like specifically for software, I guess they're not really. I guess people use it for everything, right?
True. I mean, I think. Well, just to classify that, they are software development project management tools, but the concept underpinning Jira, that being agile, I think has taken on a life of its own, right? So what I think a lot of people adopted into their personal context was the agile kind of Kanban board view that we found really useful just in our everyday lives.
I know. I've heard of people like planning weddings on Jira, which is insane to me. But people who like it, So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So I guess my first question is in your sort of day-to-day, your consulting, your various stack, what are you using? Do you use Jira, right?
Yeah. So Jira has been a long-standing project management tool that I've probably have the most experience with as a product designer, product manager, and the likes. And I have to say that's because, Jira, especially in the enterprise context, had two things going for it. One, it had the hearts and minds of the team. So, a lot of these organizations would start off on a team version of Jira and then grow, up and out from there. And so, most of the companies that I work with still are operating off of Jira. They have.
And you when you're using Jira, was it your choice, or did you just come onto the team who was already using Jira?
For most of the time, I'm letting the teams kind of select it. That's not something that I try to volunteer individuals on, unless they're trying to pick something expensive and heavy.
Right. In which case, no, we already have a Jira subscription. Let's just use it.
No. So usually, I've probably navigated. I've used everything across the board. So Pivotal Tracker, Rally, and their various enterprise tools, Jira, ClickUp, and now Linear. And I am using Linear just on a personal kind of hobby basis.
So, in terms of both of those things, you're professionally on Jira, but sort of a newer user of Linear.
Oh yeah, but it's still definitely like a 90-95%, 5-10% split.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's funny. I'm exactly the opposite. I used to use Jira all the time. My last company, we were a Jira shop when I was the head of product before, and I was part of what I did when I first got there, which is getting us into a system. This was maybe before Linear existed, or at least certainly I knew about it, and so kind of defaulted to it because for a long time it felt like the only choice. If you're a serious software company, you're using Jira because that's what serious software people do. But lately, I'm on Linear now, so I've got a couple of client projects, and I didn't select it in any case. I sort of came onto the project and they were already using that tool, but I had heard about it. I think what's interesting, sort of a little bit of an origin story, is the founder of Linear was a designer of all things from Airbnb, who was basically Jira sucks and I want something better. And so I use that. So I use Linear quite often professionally now, and I never use Jira anymore, or I don't in any of my current contexts. But I have used it for many years at previous companies. So my experience is a little out of date, but I certainly remember a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear, right? We all know the product manager who loves to flex their Jira skills. And
Oh
I
yeah.
feel like that became, you know, it always, for me, it's always a warning sign when the management tool uh, starts to become the thing that you're managing more than
Oh
the
man.
actual software that's there. And the challenges that I've had with Jira in the past is the amount of time I'm spending kind of configuring and customizing, and then and I know so many people who geek out on just that stuff, like creating fancy workflows and items in Jira, but for to what end? Like to what value end is that happening? So I'm often trying to arc towards the least resistance possible and the most simplistic setup in a tool, which I think is where linear is starting to capture my attention.
I think that's totally right, because Jira is complicated, right? And it's because of its configurability. That's also why it's powerful, and why maybe big enterprises like it, is because they can make it sort of fit their workflow. But it's so funny. I know those product managers too, which is like this overcomplication, and as a result, like it's really fancy, but then no one else knows how to use it, right? And then they have to they spend half their time like teaching people their Jira workflow, which is a giant waste of time. Like it's like these coordination tasks that goes with it. But at the same time, it's like it's very powerful in that way. But it begs the question, like as a sort of a software design strategy, like the very different tack between linear and Jira, whereas Jira is very much an enterprise tool that has years of bloat, whereas linear is this younger, very opinionated design tool that has a very clear point of view on how you should manage software projects. And a lot of that complexity isn't baked in, but I will caveat by saying, yeah, it's new relative to Jira.
Yeah, so one of the things that I want to make sure we give credit where credit's due is Jira was like the team's choice of tool, right?
Yes.
I think Jira has become kind of what it is today because of the demands of enterprise stakeholders.
Yeah, the
And
victim of its own success.
yeah, not necessarily the demands of the teams, that were using it, right? So the desire for an enterprise to manage every little thing from a top-down perspective has caused a lot of I know difficulties on the Jira side to kind of re-architect it and make sure that they could scale and show progress around highly complex projects within large enterprises at scale, while still being able to give the teams whatever management flow or team dynamics they wanted. I also think, like, Jira grew up during an age and time where agile transformations were the thing that everybody was discovering, right?
Right.
And as a result of that, there was a lot of companies that were like, well, we want to figure out how agile works for us. And, we need to maybe operate it in a very different way than other people do. And by and large, I think what we have found is that people would customize agile approaches so much that they would end up back to where they were originally, right? And
Yeah. Agile
it
fall.
yeah, and it's not because agile is broken, but rather because the discipline, the managerial like perspectives and ability to run a truly lean agile organization, we didn't have that muscle memory. And I think right now, like where linear is coming into play, is in a world where, hey, we actually know what works well in agile, and there's
Right.
a method.
Everyone has come up in agile now, right?
Yes.
There was most people don't know any other way.
Well, and also the rule of kind of the core rule, which is uh, focusing on value streams. Like you got to go orient towards simplicity and focus and do no more than one thing at a time. And those are disciplines that like large enterprises never want to hear. They want
Right.
to like, oh yeah, man, that guy's really good. He can do like two or three things at a time. And the reality is that's not happening.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that like is a really clear differentiation between the two pieces of software, right? As I said at the top, like Linear's started by this designer from Airbnb, and he's got a very opinionated like point of view on what this should be. And the whole idea of, when this whole argument right now that you hear all the time about people talking about craft and taste and all this fun words that they're using to describe, it's something that they have had basically baked into the DNA from the beginning. It was like, we are going to design the best software that we think is there. Like, they don't do user testing really. They don't do a lot of like user research. They're just, they're a software company building software to make software. So they're using, their own tool, and they're evolving it as time goes on. So it's really interesting because they focused, as unsurprisingly a designer would, on like ease of use, right? And so as a result, nowadays, if you think about, like, if you're starting a project now today, if we're starting a new company, you and I, a software product, like, you're almost always going to go to Linear, because that experience of getting you in and on is so much easier than trying to configure a Jira board, right? And I think people will default to it. And as a result, like, they're going to ride the tide versus like this insane configuration that Jira sort of requires. And I think that onboarding is a real value add at the beginning, because they're targeting startups, and then they'll ride the wave with them. But like, I'm curious, when you started up, putting your personal stuff into Linear, like, did you find that to be true?
Yeah. Design preferences aside, because I'll kind of put a little spin on this, because I don't think we're in a world where it's about like which PM tool is nicer, right? And there's some clear like design-based wins, but it's like it's more about the interface to your agents, right? So we went from this world of like mobile first to now where I feel like Linear is one of the first agent first software systems, that have come out. And what I found really interesting was less about, the simplicity of the interface, all of that. Those are things that I naturally gravitate towards, and I'm a fan of the opinionated flow that Linear puts forward. But what I found more compelling was, and this part's actually a little bit more complex, but how easy and quickly and adaptable it was to integrate directly into my Claude code and GitHub pipelines, right?
Yeah, the direct connection. Oh yeah, it's interesting.
And that was
I can tell you a little bit
simple,
what I've got.
right?
Yeah.
And I mean, Linear agents can now take an issue, open a PR, and go, right? Whereas like in Jira, especially if you have it customized, like, I think you're still, the board still may have like 14 meaningless like custom values of status, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody wanted to complicate. Well, it's not really green. It's greenish yellow
Right.
on the status of something. And I appreciate kind of the fresh perspective that Linear brings, to an opinionated perspective to that.
That's really interesting, because I think, as we think about, and we've talked about this before, there is a new emerging user for these products, and that is the agents, right? And in certain ways, Linear simplicity is useful for that, because it doesn't have to navigate and understand a lot of complexity. So it can go right in, because I do it the same way. I have Cloudfoot hooked straight into it. It updates tickets for me. It like goes back for that connected to GitHub. I run status reports out of it. It's pretty cool. Even though they're trying to bake their own sort of, like agent on the front of it, where I don't really use that as much. I just typically connect it and use it, which gets back to the idea of like who owns the interface, but that's a different conversation. But it is interesting to think about that versus Jira, which is, if you connect an agent to it, like what is it connecting to? Or if you connect the MCP that sits on, how many APIs does Jira have in it? Like hundreds probably, right? And so it has a risk of really getting lost and confused and not knowing necessarily how to do it, because it's designed for complicated human workflows.
Yeah. And I mean, I think Linear would probably agree with what I'm about to say, but when I look at where the future is heading, right, something like Linear is the future of the software development interface. I think the issue tracker is actually becoming, or has already become, the most important tool in software development. And I still don't believe almost nobody is ready for what that really means in the context. And that comes from two angles. One, it has the potential to hold all the context around your software system that the coding agents need to operate on, because
Right.
agents are writing real code, but they need a place to read intent and write status updates, right? And the more that we start to pull that out of the IDE in some worlds, you start to ask, well, what does the UI of software development look like? And to me,
I
that's
totally
linear.
agree. And then they've already started to bake that in. But I would say, like, when you talked about that, the context engine, right? That, and we've talked about that with Dropbox and with Notion in previous episodes. I think this is actually a place where Jira has a huge advantage, which is that they've got years, if not decades, of context for a lot of enterprises. And so, will they make it easy to get it in or out of there versus like forcing you to use their own internal AI tool, which again, like we've talked about this concept before, which is, this sort of like platform lock-in and like data exfiltration versus, if it not playing nicely with other pieces of your system. But at the same time, if you are IBM, right, and you've been using Jira for 20 years, like the amount of context in there about how your systems work is like unbeatable. I mean, there's like almost nothing you can do to have it. You are completely locked to them.
I feel like the missed opportunity, or potentially not missed, but like the real opportunity for someone like Jira, is that they have so much meta data and context around, for example, what stories flow across, what systems in certain industries the fastest, right? So, do you have a utility company that, according to Dora, is deploying once a week? If so, like, what's the meta framework around how they're managing those stories? What are the rituals? And can you actually deliver that insight to other organizations around what the best practices to help them speed up, their delivery processes?
That's interesting. It makes me think too of like, even internally, how can it speed up, right? Think about all the times like a PM writes a ticket, right? And an engineer has questions on the ticket, right? Whereas like over time, it should be able to be like, hey, engineer X is going to like ask these follow-up questions, so like, why don't we get ahead of that and like, sort of proactively put in the ticket. Then again, like, is it just going to go straight to an agent, a coding agent in the end of the day anyway? So,
well, I mean, can you imagine Jira recommending, or Linear in this context, right? Recommending a backlog item or a feature item to be prioritized potentially after you've submitted or written something. So you go into sprint planning and maybe you have a ticket for something that needs a spike, and the agent says, hey, we should create this spike ticket before you do that. Or
I absolutely could.
Test-driven development works better and you aren't doing it. What if I wrote a user story for you to develop this test for your for the agent or the software engineering?
I might even argue that in that case, like Atlassian has the advantage because they've got Confluence. Right. And like, if all of a sudden, if you're creating all your product documentation and, the like PRDs and that kind of thing, their product strategy docs there, like they have access to it. That's not to say, again, to your earlier point, like Linear now has like MCP access. I mean, you could easily plug it into Notion or any of these other tools, or even just create tickets that are context that sit in like a status of context, right? It wouldn't be that hard to configure it. But I think that's really interesting because right now, like it's a good example. When I'm doing custom software projects, I create a build plan, right? And then, I go back and forth with what the plan is. And as I like architect at the system, and then as I go through every time I go, I'm like, okay, I come in, I'm like, all right, like look at the build plan, like what's the next most important item? And it'll look at everything and be like, based on what we're trying to do and the architecture and the order of operations, this is what you should do next, right? And like, in some cases, I would argue like, I am the roadblock, because it's like, okay, if you already knew that, like it shouldn't have even required me to like approve it. At some level, like you could have probably just done this. Like there are places where I have to interject, but I could absolutely see either of those tools saying like, okay, I'm going to move these through in the order that they need to be in.
Yeah, and I think it's gonna bring a harder focus around what the rituals are. Meaning, like, are we in planning mode? Like, what's the space where we do that? I'll give you an example, right? Like Slack is where we talk, right?
Right.
So are you talking with the agent and the team and brainstorming in there before it goes onto the backlog? Because I think what these tools are becoming, and they were once, I remember designing at Rally for, planning mode and like how you do that with these features.
Mm.
So that you could brainstorm with the team effectively and then crystallize, lock the backlog in and go. And I think what these tools are becoming is a little bit more upstream of the build where, the tracker now is like, this is the stuff that's already
Right.
hardened and ready to build. So how does
And it understands the
brainstorming?
tech stack underneath, and you come up with ideas and it's like, well, you want to do this, like, no problem. Like, basically you have 90% of this. Like, this is just a couple of lines of code. That Claude did that to me today. I was like, in the same, this thing I was talking about, I was like, what can I work on? I even said, I was like, I have 15 minutes before our call. Is there anything we can knock out real quick from this list? And it was like, oh, let's do this, and it was like something that was down the to-do list, but it was like, hey, we'll just get it done now. And sure enough, it took 5 minutes, not even 15. That was
Yeah.
that, right? Because it had all the context that it needed. I imagine these tools will start to become that.
So, what we're talking about, just to kind of reframe, is I think these tools becoming more of the software build interface, for lack of a better word,
Right.
and less of what they were historically used for, which was documentation of like the details around a software product, right? Because now that starts to kind of get that specification and stuff starts to get baked in and automated.
But you'll still
And
need documentation, just a different kind though, right?
yeah,
It's
but
like, it's more
in this
about user
world,
stories and
yeah, but so where I was going with this is that it became a documentation of a lot of ideas, right? And is there a world where we start to shift away from this? Like, is there a world where we're executing so fast, there is no backlog? And what and in some would argue that if you don't have a backlog to manage, do you really need a tool like Jira or Linear?
well, yeah. And I mean, probably, right? Probably because like you do need place to park ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, I don't know. Now that I said that out loud, I'm not entirely sure that's true. Do you need a place to park ideas? Or like, do you just execute? I mean, that's the thing. Or if it's like, oh, hey, we have an idea that we want to try, but like before we start building something, we need to go validate or talk to people or whatever, right? Like, or where does the information get stored that leads to those conversations, right? I just went and talked to 30 users, and I have now like a theory or a philosophy or a feature that I want to ship. What happens now? Like, does Linear become the place where you store the artifacts of those things and it does the synthesis for you? But then at that point, is it just like an interface on top of Cloud Code?
Yeah, it's just executing.
Is that what we're describing?
Yeah, I'm continuously fascinated by this idea of getting to a point with AI where we're executing at the speed of ideas, right, and at the speed of thought. And I think we're close to.
So this is actually a great point, even, because I actually think this is something that I've noticed with Linear in particular recently, which is they're shipping really fast all of a sudden. And it's not surprising why. All of us, you've got these tools like the Claude codes, and I'm sure Linear, being Linear, their integration and their workflow with Claude Code is probably pretty loud. But what I've noticed from there is I'm now starting to have a hard time keeping up with their new releases, right? And I'm starting to have a hard time understanding some of the things that they're coming out with. And as a result, and I think Claude runs into this too, as another company that you see a lot of like very rapid iteration and development, right? And so when you see Linear, because we're talking about them shipping faster due to AI, I've got two kind of questions on this. And the first is like, in an organization that has had traditionally a lot of like product discipline around what they're shipping, right? You know, that taste and craft that people keep talking about, they were kind of the archetypes of that. What happens when all of a sudden, like, they can just release anything they want at any time, right? Like, there is no backlog, right? So how do those things exist or coexist, those ideas, right? So I think that's the first question. And then the second question is, like, assuming that they're only shipping things that they like love and have wanted to do, and they're on board and it passes all of their discipline, all stuff. How do you keep users like on top of it? And I think that's the part that I'm really struggling with. I mean, even Claude, which I use all day long, every day, like, has 100 features I don't know about because they release like a new something every week. And Linear is like that now. Every week I open up that little thing as in the bottom left, and it's like, here's this new stuff. And it's like trying to keep track of that. You know, you've been in enterprise software, you know, like, there's a risk to releasing where, like, your existing customers like don't know what's there. Like, that communication, that user adoption and that product education is really hard, right? So if all of a sudden you're tripling the speed of that, so I don't know. It's two different ideas, but I'm curious, like, how you think about those.
So first and foremost, I think the speed that we're witnessing is not fast. It's actually the new standard.
Right.
And what I think
there's downsides.
Yeah. And what I think is fascinating about that is we're going to enter into a period where it is no longer about whether or not something has a feature, because the feature, you know, in the world that we're talking about, a request can be made and then be executed and deployed so that it's immediately available. You know,
right.
You can ask Claude Code to augment, right, a missing feature in many ways. So
you can start eating competitors.
So there's a world in a way where I think feature development to the consumer is going to matter less and less, and it really becomes more about me as a user. Do I have the creativity and you know, the strategic contextual wherewithal to really come up with some gnarly ideas that can move needles, right? The lazy product management of just like listening to data and users, those gaps are going to get closed automatically, you know, by AI agents that can, you know, really execute, you know, read and execute that, you know, immediately as it comes up. And, you know, the more that limitations go away in enterprise software and your interaction with these design systems, the more it's about paying attention to what am I asking for and where am I trying to like get the direct, the vector of execution pointing towards. And that's a very different way of thinking about the world. That I don't think a lot of people are prepared for.
No, because I think traditionally we've operated in a world where things are scarce, right? And so, where at least code is scarce, right? By prior, and people keep saying like software, you know, development was never the hard part. It's like, the fuck it was. Like, it was very hard and it was expensive. That's why we had backlogs, and that's why, you know, developers were traditionally good ones were, you know, $300,000 plus a year, you know. And so I think you're going to see this world where, like, all of a sudden it goes away completely, and now all of a sudden you have to, that discipline around like what you are executing, to your point, is going to be so important. And then, but it made me think, like, well, as you were talking, I started to think about something else I've been hearing a bit about, which is the flattening of organizations, right? As these tools become more prominent and more used within the organization, you know, this sort of operational stack collapses, for lack of a better word, right? You get this like middle layer that goes away. But tools like Linear and definitely Jira are very much built for a world where coordination costs were high and coordination was hard. You know, and like, that's honestly part of its whole reason for being, which is that coordination taxes are real, you know, and all of a sudden, like, that's going to start to go away. So does that chip away at their value prop?
I think it shifts it, right? So Atlassian may hate me for saying this, right? But if you think of Atlassian as having been built for a world of reporting to stakeholders,
yeah,
and Linear having been built for a world towards execution, not reporting towards reporting.
Builders, not managers.
Yeah, that's where we start to see the divide. And I mean, I by no means think Atlassian is losing this race at all. I mean, I think there's still, there's still they have a deep moat, as we mentioned, in data that can carve out reporting. Organizations aren't going to shift, rapidly. Like people hug their BI reports close to their chest because that gives them the security to make decisions.
People overestimate the rate of adoption. I agree.
Yeah, but that is shifting, right? And then that's what I think we're getting at, which is, the value of execution has always been there, and it continues to increase in value. And I see a product like Linear sort of directly attacking the world of Jira to say, hey, we're built for execution, tie in with agents that are coding, right? Linear is built for a world of just managing people's work and reporting it to stakeholders. And I think that's where we're starting to kind of see the divide in what is an enterprise software product and what is it really supposed to do.
Yeah, what is it supposed to do? That's interesting. Like, who are the stakeholders involved, right?
And
I mean, that's going to make it interesting, because the difference between, in enterprise software, the difference between customers and users, right? Like, you're selling to the same company, but the person who buys it and pays is different than the person who uses it, right? Jira is optimized for the customer.
Yeah, and if I have to spend money on a team to manage your software product that manages things, like that part in enterprise software is going to go away, right?
Right.
Like,
it does feel like being able to use a tool is not a skill you're like going to care about anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've seen that slowly erode anyways with some software as a service products, not the big ones. But I think in an AI first world, you start to see that rapidly disappear. It changes the flavor. A lot of organizations that I'm talking to now, we're talking about what for lack of a better word, an AI platform team looks like. So individuals that are managing skills, managing, the RAG data for an organization in there. I think that's kind of like the new sysadmin of the organization, right?
Yeah.
How are you taking our data? How are we managing the skills? How are we driving competitive consistency and quality in the AI agents that are supporting whatever the frontline worker is? It could be a software engineer, a customer support agent, whatever those new roles are in that world.
That's really interesting. I think these tools, both of them, frankly, are very well suited for the task, because of what they are and where they sit in the workflow.
Yeah, and I think if an organization like Atlassian does not have strong opinions about that they're going to start to put into their product, I think that's where they're going to start to run into more trouble, and someone like Linear can kind of eat their lunch, because the providing good defaults and opinion and strong opinions that can kind of orient these organizations toward faster execution and better quality, that is actually going to help drive the needle and the AI transformation within a company a lot quicker and easier than just saying, hey, like, we could do this any way you want, because then the organization doesn't even know really where to start to get the outcomes that they want.
It's true. And they could, having that starting board. And at the very least, I haven't done this a long time, so this may exist, but if I wanted to just start up a new Jira board, it should be opinionated and have that point of view. I think my correct or incorrect assumption is, like, if I was to just spin up a Jira board today, I'd have to do a lot of configuration and it would be hard. I haven't done that in a long time, so that might not be true, but that is absolutely my impression. Right. Whereas, like, I've started a Linear board the other day. It took 2 seconds. I was like, good, I'm in. It already has the columns defined. You're like, good to go.
And in my experience, the people that need and want the most customizations are usually the ones that are worst at efficiency.
That's a really good call.
They think their business is special. And when I very, very rarely, like, especially when it comes to something like software development, right? Yeah, you can have a lot of compliance standards, you can have a lot of security protocols, and there's things that we have to do along the pipeline and everything. It doesn't change the fact that like one user story per engineer needs to go through certain gates, right? And I've found that a lot of people, a lot of organizations, I should say, like want to feel that they're special and they need to do kind of some of these nuanced operations. Very rarely does it really do I see it pan out or be something that's required to drive greater efficiency in their operations.
Well, I think going back to the flattening of the orgs, like that's the first shit that's gonna go. Just like, oh, if we have to build all this custom shit in order to even coordinate and move forward in the same direction, and like that's the first thing that's gonna be like, get this the fuck out of here. Like I feel like anything that has any role that has, role ops is fucked. Like design ops, dev ops, product ops, like anything with ops. Like if you need that, like fucking, you're done. Like all these tools are just going to collapse that completely.
Yeah, it's going to become just automated, and if I want something or if I want to do something in a specific way, it'll just be executed.
Right.
I do agree with that. I do think it's transforming though to AI ops. Like I don't think that's actually going away, and that's what I was saying around like an AI platform team, where it's like how are if a system or a work stream is not getting the output that we desire, or there's a problem, a bug shows up, something to that effect, there is an AI platform team that has to go through, look at the skills, look at the RAG data, like why is something showing up, and then potentially doing a modification to the way an AI agent processes, stories or certain things for that improvement. And that, whether you call that an AI platform team or an AI ops team,
it's like infrastructure
that actually remaining and growing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's going to be the big opportunity now is, finding a way to make all of your information in the organization queryable to AI systems and accessible to everyone, so that I can, whether it's on my internal system or whatever, I can be, no matter what, I can say like, hey, answer me this question, like how many clicks did our latest ad campaign get on Facebook or whatever, and it's just there and accessible and it's correct, right? So I can use all that. But I think there's going to be, I agree that at large scale companies, especially big enterprises like that, that's going to be a big one, and I think they'll be able to use Jira as a starting point for that.
Yeah,
I think Linear will have a harder time.
I'm just increasingly interested in how, because historically products like Linear were developed for product managers almost exclusively, right? Like managing an engineering team.
Right.
They slowly got better, and I feel like the tightening, the closer and closer they're getting to the actual dev pipeline is where the interesting aspect is coming in. And that's where I see eventually Linear going, is it being kind of fully tied to a CI/CD pipeline, around that. And that's how it effectively, when you have that riding on top of the dev pipeline, now the IDE, now that issue tracker is the new interface, or IDE.
It's funny you say that, because one of their new releases, which I couldn't keep track of, is I think almost exactly what you're describing, and it came out last week. And I remember seeing the little box in Linear about how it sits on top of your CI/CD pipeline and does. And I read it for a minute, and I was like, I'm busy, I got other things to do. But it's another example of like a huge feature set that they released super quickly that I'm, like I don't have time to learn what this is. I'm going to do something else now.
But I mean, that's where it gets really interesting, right? Because now I open up, Linear's clean interface, if you will. Maybe I have like a template on how to write a spec. I have the human spec template where, okay, I write it out. I make sure it captures my intent, right? Very holistically. That gets translated into an AI dev spec. Maybe even off of that, it's saying, hey, we need to cut up the story into these ways. And then it's like, are you ready to go? And once it is, the agent just executes, right?
Right. And it can come back and pressure test all the ideas against all the context it already has against the technical stack and against the other features that might be in the pipeline, against other contexts that it has, right? If it's able to even question your assumptions, that's the one that I think about a lot. Is all of a sudden you're writing a requirement story and it all of a sudden it like looks back at some interviews and be like, actually, your interview summary doesn't support this, and giving access to those tools where it can start to be that engine. I think you're right. It's just going to be basically a Kanban board where you watch a bunch of agents talk to each other.
Yeah, I think, just going back, like, this is where, even when you're writing those specs and intent, like, that's a form of opinionated leadership. And I think what we're going to see in this new world is a lot more opinionated leadership being asked of leaders, companies, and the whole nine to sort of prove where their intent is, right? And I have a whole sidetrack that's kind of branching away where I do think, an immutable mission, orienting towards kind of the advancement of humanity in this context is going to become a lot more important, not just lip service that companies are going to have to attribute to for this very reason. Because, if you can execute things at the speed of intent, we kind of need to know what your intent is a lot more.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting place. Okay. All right. We've come a long way from where we started here. Do you have anything we haven't talked about in these contexts? If you were starting a new project today, which one would you use?
Linear, but maybe that's also because of, my nature.
Yeah.
It's the shiny new object, and
right.
In full transparency, I haven't tried linear out with a team yet, just because I'm operating it, I'm using it solo. So I'm craving that kind of experience, right? Like let me get an actual team on this, seeing how all of the collaboration and communication comes together. I can see what they're doing. And I think that's really interesting.
It took me a little while when I first started using it with a team to understand its specific, because it is opinionated. Like you can't, with Jira, you can nest everything under everything else and call it whatever. Whereas in linear, it's like there is a specific hierarchy, and it took me a minute to get the hierarchy. But once I got it, then it was very clear to me. But it took a minute.
I do have a separate question, which is around the idea of bloat. And in this, we just talked about a world where, I see features kind of disappearing, right? Because the infinite is possible. So anything's possible with AI, therefore, features are just executed. What does bloat look like in that world? Like, what is actual bloat, in an AI world? And, does opinionated ever become bloated?
Maybe it's a good question, right? Because if you think about what a feature is, like, do we define that as you're adding a new something to the UI, right? Like a capability of something, like, to the UI itself. But even as the UI collapses and you start to talk to Claude directly, which hooks straight into the database of the tool you're using, or if you're even like linear, for example, and Jira both have AIs like that sit on top that you can just like query directly, right? And so the question becomes, like, what is a feature at that point? And I have a hard time answering that question. It'd be like in the old world, it's like, oh, we're going to add the ability to export this to a PDF or whatever it is. Whereas now, if I can just say like, hey, if I'm talking to the chat board, say, hey, I need a PDF of this. And if it can't do it, it just like goes and spins up its own ticket, and runs it through the dev pipeline, releases the feature, and then sends you the PDF, right?
I think, as you're talking, I'm thinking, and one of the things that struck me is I don't think features become bloat anymore. Namely because a feature's there for the person who finds it most useful. What I think becomes bloat in this new world is workflows, right? Like workflows that are not optimized, redundant, overly complex, redundant in some capacity. So somebody wants to like triple check something that, you know, statistically has no significance of needing to be triple checked.
Right.
You know, and that's kind of the interesting, because it's we're getting now more into the world of the way people work rather than the tools as a concept of bloat. And that's where, just going back to linear, I think it becomes even more important to like have those opinionated point of views on, you know, what the order of operations or the how is being.
So you'll think you'll end up with a series of tools that are basically like, okay, let's take software development, this category. It's just a series of tools that say like Linear says you should make software this way, and Jira says you should make software this way, and ClickUp says you make software this way, and whatever way you think you like vibe with is the one you use.
I mean, when you say it that way, I don't like it, right?
That's opinionated.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible, right? Because each one has their own context engines, right?
Or is it just a world of infinite features where you're like, okay, when I'm spinning up my flow, like I just want to like, I'm going to tell you what I want and you're going to spin it up for me. And at that point, like, what is software?
I think the open-ended one is still there, right? And
yeah,
I think the optimization. The reason I think what you said previously about like Linear and all of these having their own method and that being executed, I think there's a there. And why is because they, behind the scenes, right, can have a trade secret around how they ingest context and do the RAG training and optimize around that to orient towards a specific quality and quality scale, right? Or output that guarantees like a certain amount of quality yet to be defined. Maybe that's, you know, on Jira, you're able to execute multiple times a day with 98% accuracy. On Linear, you're able to do the same thing, but with 99.5% accuracy.
Oh, that's interesting. Right? And then maybe it's like about preserving. It's like, oh, Linear can do it with 95% of the tokens that Jira does, you know?
I think that's where the competition goes. So I do think there's a there with what you're saying. I think it's less about preference and more about outcome of like at like AI speed and scale. That's going to be a competitive advantage.
Yeah. What world. All right. We've talked for a long time. Any parting thoughts as we wind this down?
No, I don't know that I'm like, my last thought, I definitely believe that Linear is becoming the new IDE. I think these systems are being taught to like hold the context, and you know, I'm excited to see more agent first products kind of come into market similar to Linear, and see how that's ultimately going to change the way the teams, you know, come together around delivering products and creative artifacts.
Yeah, it's really interesting. My parting thought is really like, every time we have these conversations, I sort of end up in the same place, which is, what is software even going to be going forward, right? You know, at some point, as the capabilities collapse, like, and anything is possible at any point. The speed of intent, you called it, I love that. You know, what does that world even look like? And I don't even have like a point of view on it, or I can't even imagine it. So I'm excited to see where it goes. Obviously, we're in it, we're shaping it. You know,
I mean, the final piece I'll say is, you know, if the issue tracker, as I'm suggesting, is the new IDE, because that's where the intent lives, then Jira versus Linear is really a fight over who owns the interface to your agents.
Right. Yes. I think that is absolutely where it's going to go, because they're the most logical places for agent coordination and agent orchestration.
Yeah.
Right. And at least in this context.
And in the software world, that's going to come down to also which one of them, you know, ends up, you know, how they develop the pipeline underneath and you know, create opinionation and special sauces around the delivery of that.
Yeah, proprietary coding skills and that kind of thing. Cool. All right. Well, I think that takes us to our time.
Thank you,
Thank you for
everyone.
listening. If you've been with us this long, we appreciate you. Thank you for listening to Acquired Taste. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a yet undisclosed topic. And we only disclose it, don't disclose it because we don't know it.
Thank you.
See you soon. Thank you.